Geocentricity, the hidden scientific evidence. The Earth is at the center of the universe. We will be examining the results of some experiments concerning astronomy. But before we do so, I would like to present two particular points that will have a huge bearing on all that follows. The first is, what would you think of a university, or indeed the whole university system around the world, that deliberately never mentions to their science students three important experiments, simply because they completely contradict the present accepted orthodox views of our planetary system and astronomy in general? This is what has actually happened. The second is a scenario that I would like you to think about. Imagine that you are in a small boat in the middle of a very large circular lake. Not far away is a very large liner, and it seems to be going around you regularly. You know how far away it is, and from the time it passes a light on the shore of the lake, you can work out that it is traveling at, say, 30 miles an hour. But it dawns on you that it might be you traveling around the liner, and you cannot tell whether it is you circling the liner or the liner circling you. But there is an easy way to determine which of these two possibilities is correct. All you have to do is to put your hand in the water. If you seem to be moving at about 30 miles an hour, then it is you circling round the liner. But if you are almost stationary, then it is the liner traveling around you at 30 miles an hour. Now that is a scenario that I would like you to bear in mind in this video. All orthodox models of the planetary system have all the planets circling the Sun in an anti-clockwise direction, as seen from our North Pole. And in addition, the Earth is spinning on its axis, also in an anti-clockwise direction. On its orbit around the Sun, the Earth travels at 30 kilometers per second through the ether. In 1887, Michelson and Morley carried out an experiment to check this speed of the Earth through the ether. They passed light through two long arms, one in the direction of the Earth's travel and the other at right angles to it. The light traveling in the direction of the Earth's travel should have taken longer to return than that traveling at right angles to the Earth's direction of travel. To the amazement of the scientific world, no such speed as 30 kilometers per second was detected. But they did get speeds between 1 and 10 kilometers per second. Ignoring these speeds, this experiment is always referred to as giving a null result. This shook the scientific world, and to overcome the implication that the Earth was stationary, they invented the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. This claimed that the arm that was in the direction of the Earth's travel became shorter, so that the time to return was the same as in the other arm. There was absolutely no justification for such a solution. It was only invented to overcome the idea that the Earth was stationary in the ether. As Arthur Miller stated, this invention of the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction was a physics of desperation. So troubling was this to scientists that eventually Einstein produced his relativity theory, by which he overcame the problem by simply abolishing the ether. He first said that he did not know of the Michelson-Morley experiment, but later admitted that he produced his theory to overcome the Michelson-Morley result. But abolishing the ether caused many problems with Einstein's relativity theory, which I have exposed in a separate video dealing with this fraudulent theory that is maintained by propaganda. Einstein's biographer commented, "The problem that now faced science after the Michelson-Morley null result was considerable, for there seemed to be only three alternatives. The first was that the Earth was standing still, which meant scuttling the whole Copernican theory and was unthinkable. The second was that the ether was carried along by the Earth in its passage through space, a possibility which had already been ruled out to the satisfaction of the scientific community by a number of experiments, notably those of the English astronomer James Bradley. The third solution was that the ether simply did not exist, which to many 19th century scientists was equivalent to scrapping current views of light, electricity, and magnetism and starting again. Notice that the last two possibilities are quite different from the first one. The first possibility is rejected not because there was any scientific result that contradicted it. Indeed, it is the only one that fits all the results of the experiments carried out. The other two run into huge experimental problems, requiring much mathematical juggling and sleight-of-hand tricks to come to their defense. The first is rejected because of the purely philosophical horror of having to accept the possibility that the Earth truly is stationary and at the center of the rotating ether. The Earth really is at the center of the universe. It is the geocentric model that actually has by far the best support from the scientific results we have been examining and the simplest explanation of them. The Michelson-Morley experiment is the only one of four experiments that is well known. The other three experiments never taught are: 1. The Michelson-Gale experiment that showed that the ether was passing across the surface of the Earth once every 24 hours. 2. Airy's failure experiment proved that it was the moving starlight carried by the rotating ether that was passing across the stationary Earth. 3. The Sagnac experiment that proved there was an ether, thus demolishing relativity theory. I have made separate videos giving more detailed explanations of the last two. Let us examine briefly these three experiments. The Michelson-Gale experiment used sealed tubes covering a large area that measured the speed of the ether relative to the surface of the Earth. They obtained a value that was within 2% of the known speed of about 0.45 kilometers per second at the equator. But this speed could have been due either to the Earth spinning in a stationary ether or the passing of the rotating ether around a stationary Earth. It was Airy's failure experiment that proved it was the moving ether passing across a stationary Earth. If the Earth was stationary and the stars were stationary, the starlight would come straight into the telescope. However, if the telescope is moving at, say, 5 miles an hour, you would then have to tip the telescope, let us say, 5 degrees to see the star. However, if the starlight is being carried across the surface of a stationary telescope at 5 miles an hour, you would still have to tip the telescope at 5 degrees to see it. So you cannot tell which one is stationary. To see whether it is the telescope or the stars that are moving, all you have to do is to fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the light when it is in the telescope. If it is the telescope that is moving, then you have to tip the telescope a little further because of the slower speed of the light in the telescope. However, if it is the stars that are moving past the stationary telescope, then the telescope does not have to be tipped any further because the starlight is coming in at the correct angle anyway. That Airy failed to find any further tipping was needed proved that it was the telescope and therefore the Earth that was stationary. This important conclusion was not even mentioned in his report. It was too explosive. Sagnac split a beam of light and sent the two beams in opposite directions around a path, recombined the beams and noted their interference fringes. The whole system was on a turntable, and he then turned it at 2 revolutions per second, remeasured the fringes, and found that they had changed. This was due to the movement of the mirrors, made the path for one beam longer and the other shorter. This proved that the ether existed, because once the light left the source, its speed was controlled by the comparatively stationary ether in the laboratory. This demolished Einstein's relativity theory, which had abolished the ether. So, from these 4 experiments, it is obvious that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and the sun, planets, moons, and stars are all being swept around the stationary Earth. This is the only explanation that satisfies the most obvious results of all these 4 experiments. No wonder the universities distort the Michelson-Morley experiment and do not teach the other 3 hidden experiments. In addition, I have received comments from 2 scientists complaining that they were never taught about the Sagnac experiment. The first said, "After 35 years as a professional physicist with a thesis in relativity, I only learned of the Sagnac experiment last year." Another correspondent complained that his professors never mentioned these important experiments. Dear Mr. Bowden, thank you for your enjoyable and well-written website. I've enjoyed visiting there today. I was especially interested in your comments on geocentricity, which, as noted, are controversial. The amazing thing is that none of the experiments cited were ever discussed in my undergraduate education, nor the implications cited. Yet again, we have the suppression of scientific evidence that supports creation and geocentricity. So much for the academic claim of its pursuit of truth. They should hang their heads in shame. Let us now look at 3 evidences said to prove that the Earth is spinning on its axis. Firstly, if a pendulum is suspended over the North Pole, the Earth can be seen to turn underneath it. Secondly, the Earth bulges at the equator due to the centrifugal force as it spins round. Thirdly, as air masses move from the North Pole southwards, they are moving from a high latitude that is only rotating slowly to nearer to the equator, which is revolving more rapidly. To keep the same angular momentum, the air masses slow down and moves east to west, which is the opposite of the Earth's spin, which is west to east. This change of direction is known as the Coriolis force. Now, all this evidence seems convincing, but there is one important factor that is ignored, and that is the presence of the stars. They are millions of miles away, but their huge size and colossal numbers mean that they have considerable effect upon the Earth, and this effect is known as Mach's principle. How they affect the Earth was investigated by 2 mathematicians, Barbour and Bertotti. They considered a hollow sphere, that's the mass of the stars, rotating around a solid body at the center, the Earth. They found that the pendulum, equatorial bulge, and the Coriolis forces were all reproduced on the internal sphere. Thus, they can all be accounted for not by the Earth spinning on its axis, but the stars rotating around the Earth every 24 hours. A further objection is that if the ether and all the stars, sun and planets are rotating around the Earth so rapidly, they would all be flung into space, and the remote stars traveling at millions of miles per second. But here we have another factor. The ether is extremely dense, and it's known as Planck density. It is 3.6 times 10 raised to the power of 93 grams per cubic centimeter. It is the equivalent of packing 10 raised to the power of 23 suns into the space of a single atomic nucleus. With such a high density, the whole of the planetary system and the stars are like corks in a flat pan of water. If the water is stirred around the pan, the corks are simply carried around by the much denser water. The ether, however, has some unusual properties. Amongst them are that it carries light waves and is frictionless, so bodies can travel through it without slowing down. It is a little similar to a deep-sea diver. He is under huge pressure but can still move through the water. So we see that these 4 experiments all show that it is the universe that rotates around the Earth, so that the Earth is truly at the center of the universe. We live in a geocentric universe and not a heliocentric planetary system. But the Christian will certainly ask, is there any evidence for this in the Bible? Yes, there most certainly is. First, every single reference to the sun states that it is the sun that is doing the moving. Just a few examples of very many. Ecclesiastes 1:5. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteneth to his place where he arose. Psalm 93 verse 1. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. Now these passages are often explained away by liberal Christians by saying that the Bible is only referring to the sun appearing to go round the earth. But is God's inspired word to be treated so casually? Evangelicals consider the Bible absolutely accurate in all other subjects, so why is its clear description not accepted on this subject also? Surely, in his written directives to mankind, God would say what he means and mean what he says at all times. To claim that they are only appearances is to deliberately bypass this clear account of creation. Secondly, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 states, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Thus the earth was created on the very first day of creation. Yet verse 14 says that the stars, sun and moon were not created until the 4th day. This raises the important question: what was the earth circling for 3 days before the sun was created on the 4th day? Did God have to give the earth a shove to get it moving round the sun? Surely not. He would have no problem in embedding the sun in the already rotating dense ether. So to summarize, the Michelson-Morley experiment showed that the earth was not going round the sun. The Sagnac experiment showed that the ether did exist, thus demolishing relativity. The Michelson-Gale experiment showed that the ether was passing across the Earth's surface once every 24 hours, and Airy's failure proved it was the Earth that was stationary and the ether was travelling around us. There are several questions about the geocentric model that need answering, and I have made specific videos on these, such as 1. The orrery, demonstrating that the mechanical orrery proves that the relationships between the Earth, Sun, planets and moons are all identical in both the heliocentric and the geocentric models. So you cannot prove either model from just observing the planetary system. 2. Parallax and redshift, all explained in the geocentric model. 3. The brief retrograde motion of Mars, what happens in the geocentric model. 4. The Sagnac experiment, an animated explanation. 5. Airy's failure experiment, an animated explanation. 6. Andromeda's wake ridiculed my first geocentric video. I made a reply video highlighting his devious arguments and false logic. On this subject of critical videos, Geocentricity has made one entitled Geocentric Science Response, which is clearly directed at my first geocentrism video. I will here briefly reply. He states that Michelson and Morley were measuring the relative motion through the ether, not the sun or the universe. But if the motion through the ether was small or nil, how could the Earth still be said to be circling the sun at 30 kilometers per second? His self-contradiction is obvious. He claims that the Michelson-Morley result did not lead them to conclude the Earth was motionless or the center of the universe, and the solar system was moving through the universe. Any scientist who even hinted at the possibility of the Earth being motionless, and therefore by implication that it was at the center of the universe, was very well aware that it would have resulted in ridicule from his peers and his professional suicide. He says that Airy's failure was reported in the Michelson-Morley article. The report said an alternative explanation failed to account for the fact proved by experiment that the aberration was unchanged when observations were made with a telescope filled with water. Firstly, they admit that the results are puzzling and contradict the results of the aberration experiments. This puzzlement continues throughout this paper. Secondly, they refer to Airy's experiment, but do not mention his name. Neither do they give a reference to his paper. I wonder why. The Michelson-Gale experiment, he says, to everybody's surprise, and again, it is one of those experiments that is not often referred to, hardly ever. They found that the ether was moving across the face of the Earth within 2% of the expected value. Yet he then says it is well documented, discussed, and repeatedly tested. How can a paper be hardly referred to, yet discussed and repeatedly tested? I am always intrigued how critics invariably shoot themselves in the foot. I will not bother the viewer with all his self-contradictions, deliberate obfuscations, and distractions like these that continue for the rest of the video. All this shows that this planet is at the very center of God's interest. He created a perfect earth and placed man on it. But man rebelled against this loving God. God still loves us, but as he is infinite, the punishment for our rebellion was also infinite. Man had nothing to give, so God punished his Son for our rebellion. Those that accept this fact by faith are loved by God and can be certain that they will live with this wonderful triune God for all eternity. It is on this earth, and this earth alone, that God has centered the playing out of the one and only performance of this great drama of the universe.